We serve a great God. And I want to share this story with you from the book of 1 Kings today and encourage you wherever you are, at home watching, hopefully with your family, and you're able to be together. Those of you who are here, I'm sure glad that you're able to be here and we're able to worship God together. So as we get into our story today, let's just pause and ask God to bless our reading of His Word. Father in heaven, we invite you to be present here among us. Again, particularly now as we open your Word together, we invite you into our hearts. We invite you to speak to us and to change us. In Jesus' name, amen. It was a time of apostasy. In fact, the people of Israel had been worshiping idols so long that few people in the nation even remembered that there was a God of Israel. This had started at the time of the fall of the United Monarchy. For 120 years, the entire nation of Israel had been united together under a single king, all 12 tribes united as one nation. First was King Saul, you remember. And then after him was King David, and then his son Solomon. And then during the reign of Solomon's son, Rehoboam, there was a major revolt in the nation. A man named Jeroboam led 10 tribes in rebellion against Rehoboam's rule, and the kingdom became divided. Rehoboam remained the king of the tribe of Judah, with the tribe of Benjamin as their ally, and they became the nation of Judah. And then in the north, Jeroboam became the king of these 10 northern tribes, and they became known as the kingdom of Israel. But after this division, the new king Jeroboam was afraid that the people of these northern tribes would go down to Jerusalem, to the temple, to worship there as they had been commanded by God in the books of Moses. And that by their allegiance to God in Jerusalem, they might end up reuniting with the nation of Judah. Here's what he says in 1 Kings chapter 12 in verse 26. It says there, "And Jeroboam said in his heart, 'Now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah.' So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, 'You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your God, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.'" In order to maintain his political power, his authority, his position as the king of this northern nation, Jeroboam then set up his own places for worship. He created these golden calves for them, seeming to forget what had happened in the desert when the Israelites had come out of Egypt. And he said to the people as he presented these golden calves to them, "These are the gods who brought you up out of Egypt." Jeroboam brought in idolatrous priests to lead out in this worship. They set up high places and other forms of pagan worship to worship these false gods. It began with deviations from worshiping God at the temple in Jerusalem, as God had instructed his people to do, and the setting up of alternative places for them to worship. And then this progressed into turning their worship toward idols that would represent their God, would represent the Lord. And finally, it concluded with the worship of foreign gods, which became acceptable throughout the entire nation. Farther and farther, and over years and years, the northern nation of Israel slipped into apostasy, into the worship of idols and into idolatry. The worship of their God Yahweh was downplayed, and the worship of foreign gods was promoted among the people. Across generations, repeatedly, God attempted to draw his people back to them, back to him. He sent prophets to them. He appealed to them, but they had not returned. And after 70 years of this decline among the nation, the time had finally come for God to step in. You know, there was a time when God stepped into my life I had grown up in an Adventist home. I grew up as a Christian and as a believer in God. But I dropped out of college after my second year, and what little relationship that I had with God at that time began to slip farther and farther away. I stopped doing things that I would have done before, and I started doing things that I wouldn't have done. I stopped going to church. I started drinking and partying, and I wasn't keeping the Sabbath. I was eating unclean foods. I came to the point eventually where I basically was not following God in any sense. I had no relationship with Him. And finally I came to the point where one night as I was sleeping, I had a dream that woke me up to my true spiritual condition, that caused me to realize how far away from God I really had become. I was confused, but I realized that I was a long way from God, that I had slid a long way, and I hadn't realized that it had been happening. But I was awake to it now, and I understood, and I was afraid, and I didn't know what to do at that point. And I remember that a couple nights later, I was awake in the middle of the night, just in my bed, and I cried out to God in a very simple prayer. I said, God, I don't know what to do. Show me what you want me to do. And immediately God began to lead in my life in a way that would bring me back into a relationship with Him, a relationship that was beyond what I had ever experienced in the past. And so I wonder, friends, have you begun to slip away from God? Perhaps you haven't fallen into full-scale idolatry like the Israelites at this time in their history, but your spiritual life may be in a decline. Spiritual decline often works as a slippery slope. It leads from one step to another. One act of disobedience makes the next act of disobedience that much easier. And furthermore, we can get into a cycle of disobedience where we commit sin, we rebel against God in some way, some small way perhaps, but afterward we feel guilty about it. We feel perhaps some sense of shame about the way that we've acted, and that causes us then to fear God because we fear that He maybe is looking at us the way that we look at ourselves. And so we want to avoid Him because it's uncomfortable to think about Him or to be around Him because of the shame that we feel. And that only then leads to a feeling of distance between us and God, and to which we commit more sin more easily. And the cycle continues. Sin weakens our conscience. When we are in the habit of ignoring God's instructions, disobedience doesn't really seem all that bad. If it's just part of our habit, it becomes easier and easier to do. And so, friends, I want to share with you some warning signs of spiritual decline. If you find yourself doing things that you once would not have done in good conscience, or if there are things that used to bother your conscience but no longer do so, that's a warning sign of spiritual decline in your life. If you find that you have a lessened interest in spiritual things, perhaps you're no longer interested in studying your Bible or in praying or in spending time with God or in talking about Him, that's a warning sign that there may be spiritual decline in your life. If being part of a church community or a spiritual community is no longer important to you, perhaps if you used to be active in church, maybe you were involved in service or you were active in attending spiritual meetings regularly, but now you find that you're not involved in any service, in living out your spiritual life. If you only attend the worship service or you only watch online, that could be a sign of spiritual decline in your life. Maybe you regularly participated in worship on Sabbath, but now you find that you only do that very occasionally or not at all. These are warning signs that your spiritual life may be in decline. And if you are declining spiritually, you may then also recognize some of these problems begin to arise as part of that pattern. You may find a failure to hear God's voice or to recognize His leading in your life. You may find that there's a failure to recognize or give thanks to God for the blessings that He's given you, and you start to take credit for all of your own success. These are warning signs, and these are the results of spiritual decline in your life. Friends, I want you to be aware of these warning signs of spiritual decline. The Israelites had been declining spiritually now for many years. They had begun to worship idols. They had been ascribing to the favor of Baal and Ashtoreth all the gifts that God was bestowing on them. The streams that kept them fed, the dew and the rain that brought abundance to them. They began to worship the earth, the sun and the moon and the stars, the things that God had created rather than the God who made them. And the Bible tells us that it was into this backslidden state that the most apostate of all of Israel's leaders came into power. Notice what our story tells us in 1 Kings chapter 16. In 1 Kings 16 verse 29 it says, "In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab the son of Omri began to reign over Israel, and Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. And Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him." Because of this spiritual decline in Israel, the people were tolerant of Ahab's rule of apostasy. Ahab led the people farther and farther away from God. He made what Jeroboam did seem like it was no big deal. Notice what verse 31 says. It says, "He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria." Excuse me, I'm going back to verse 31. There we go. It says, "And if it had been, and as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. And Ahab made an Asherah. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, than all the kings of Israel who were before him." These few verses list 4 sins in particular that Ahab engaged in. It says that he walked in the sins of Jeroboam. That is, he hardened himself against God, and he led the people into rebellion just like Jeroboam had done. The first sin that these verses tell us about is that Ahab took Jezebel as his wife. Probably he wanted to solidify a political relationship with the king of the Sidonians. And so he established this relationship through an intermarriage with his daughter Jezebel. This, of course, was forbidden by God because of the problems of idolatry and the spread of this pagan religion that God wanted to avoid his people having to deal with. And in this particular case, Jezebel was very strong-willed. She was very dominant in the relationship. She demanded prominent positions for her gods in Israel. She was bent on spreading Baal worship among the Israelites. Now, the word Baal actually just means Lord. I'm not sure if you were aware of that. It's not the name of the god per se. It just means Lord. It's a title. And there were many Baals. In this case, it refers to Melkart, the Baal of Tyre. Tyre and Sidon were one kingdom. And Jezebel's father, Ethbaal, was actually the high priest of Baal in Sidon before he became king of Tyre and Sidon. So Ahab has married the high priest's daughter and brought her to Israel along with her gods. The second sin that Ahab committed was that he went to Sidon and he worshiped Baal there, it says, and he became his servant. So he promoted false gods then as the prominent gods of Israel by becoming the servant of Baal as he worshiped him in Sidon. The third sin that Ahab committed that we are told about in these verses is that he erected a temple and an altar to Baal in Samaria, the capital city of Israel. And finally, the fourth one is that he built an Asherah, which is a wooden idol or a sacred grove associated with the goddess Asherah. In verse 33, it says, "Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him." Under Ahab's leadership, with Jezebel as queen, Israel now has sunk lower and lower into apostasy, farther and farther from their God. And as places of idolatry were now given prominence throughout the nation, the people were drawn in by these ornate displays and by these fascinating rites of worship of these gods. The worship of these gods, Baal and Asherah, appealed to their carnal instincts as well. There was gross indulgence associated with the worship of these gods, drunkenness, all kinds of sensual acts that seemed so exciting to them. Friends, worshiping these gods was nothing like coming to a church to worship God. It was nothing like it. And when the king and queen led out by their example in this worship, the masses soon abandoned the worship of their God Yahweh. And finally then, by the time we get to 1 Kings chapter 18, we can see later in the story that Jezebel had 450 priests or prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah operating in Israel at that time. I want you to understand just how widespread and popular this became throughout the nation of Israel. Imagine if here in Spokane, as you're driving through the city, instead of seeing churches scattered here and there throughout the city, instead every church that now exists is instead a shrine of Asherah or a temple of Baal. Every single one of them receiving funding from the government. And on the other hand, there's maybe only a few small churches meeting perhaps in someone's home that are worshiping the one true God. That's how widespread this was within the culture and within the nation of Israel. And that's probably not far off from the reality of what things were like in Israel at the time. Over the years, God had tried again and again to bring the nation to an awareness of their spiritual condition, but without success. And yet, friends, God still yearned for these people who had been enticed into sin. He was about to send them one of the mightiest of his prophets, a fearless and stalwart man of prayer who would once again show that there was indeed a God in Israel. Notice what it says in 1 Kings 17 and verse 1. It says there, "Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, 'As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word.'" This verse appears here at the beginning of chapter 17 as a sudden and very dramatic interruption to the story of Israel. Out of seeming nowhere, Elijah appears. He is not associated with the king. He has no influence whatsoever. He is from a backwater town called Tishbe. Have you ever heard of Tishbe? Nothing happens in Tishbe. In fact, the word in Hebrew means settlers, and so it's really actually not clear whether this was in fact an actual town or whether Elijah the Tishbite simply means Elijah the settler, from the settlers in the back country of Gilead. In any case, Elijah is from nowhere important at all. Elijah is largely uneducated. He has no political influence. He has no money. But back there in the sticks somewhere, God's Spirit recognized a person who was faithful. Friends, it doesn't matter where you're from. You may not have had all the education to make you a leading candidate for God's service. You may not come from an important family. It is only, friends, your fidelity to God that determines the extent to which God can use you. Education is important, but only when it is coupled with faithfulness to God. An unlikely candidate, of course, but Elijah is God's best man for this job. He's clad only in the unstylish and simple clothing of a hardworking peasant, but Elijah marches straight into the palace somehow, no invitation or appointment or announcement, somehow seemingly unnoticed by the layers of guards surrounding the palace. He stands directly then in front of the king, waits for him to realize that he's there. And to Ahab in this moment, it's as though Elijah has just appeared out of nowhere. Immediately then, Elijah delivers his message of judgment. And the message that he delivers to the king is clear. Yahweh is the only God in Israel, and he only decides when to send rain and when to withhold it. Just as suddenly then, before the king even has time to really digest this message or to reflect on it or react to it, Elijah turns on his heel and walks out the way that he came in. Astonished, the king takes in what has just happened. God has just stepped in to the situation. Elijah's words have come down in the throne room like a sledgehammer. Led by Ahab and Jezebel, the people have been looking to Baal for years now to bring rain and to sustain the prosperity of their nation. Baal was supposed to have the power over these cycles of nature, over rain and thunder that gave them prosperity. And yet God's message here in this situation is there will be no rain until I say so. And in this way, God directly challenges the false gods that have been promoted among the nation. In fact, the name Elijah means Yahweh is my God. And that is Elijah's message. Over and over again in his ministry, Elijah will answer that question, who is God in Israel? Immediately after he delivers his message, God sends him off to wait. God wants the people to have time to recognize that their prayers to Baal and Asherah are worthless. You see, for many years, God had given patient opportunities for reform. He had appealed to them over and over. But God will not be patient with evil forever. God will intervene on behalf of his people. He says, those whom I love, I rebuke and discipline. He will not leave his people alone and helpless. He will not abandon them while they turn away from him and go farther and farther away. God's discipline is redemptive discipline. His purpose here is not to punish the people of Israel. It's to show them the futility of their false worship and to reveal that he, in fact, is the one who has been blessing them all along. His goal is to bring them back to him. And if it's necessary, friends, God has the right to do the same thing in your life as well. If you are his follower, but you slip away, he will guide you back. He will call out to you with love and draw you to himself. If you are his follower, but you backslide in your faithfulness to him, God is abundantly patient, friends. Look how long he waited before he intervened in this manner in the nation of Israel. But he will not leave you forever. He will not let you go without a fight. You know, one of my philosophies in life is to try to learn my lessons before I have to learn them. Friends, don't wait until it gets so bad that God has to step in to wake you up. Allow him to bring you back with gentleness. Listen to his appeals to your heart. Because the longer that you wait to come back to him, the harder it is to return. The greater the likelihood that you will never be willing to do it. Elijah, of course, didn't want to go to Ahab. He knew that this action that he had just taken put his life in grave danger. He knew what Ahab was all about. He was going against the most powerful man in the country, a man who was impetuous and self-seeking. He knew that Ahab would be out to get him forever after this moment. And the message itself, of course, seemed difficult to swallow. A drought? Here? There were rivers and streams that flowed continually. The nation was green and prosperous. If modern day Israel is to be compared, it averages about 19.5 inches of rainfall every year. That average, of course, is less than the state of Washington, for example. We have the rainy side that brings our average up, but the average in the state of Washington is 27 inches of rain a year. It's more than the average of the nation of Israel is more than the state of California, which averages just 17 inches of rainfall a year. Imagine here in Spokane, imagine the thought of the Spokane River drying up. Have you ever seen the Spokane run dry? I doubt it. It's hard even to imagine, isn't it? It was only because of Elijah's ability to trust God completely and to do exactly what God said, not because it seemed to be the most easy or the most sensible thing to do, but because God had said it. Only because of this faith was Elijah able to appear so confidently before the king. And the truth is, God was going to bring this drought whether he spoke through Elijah or not. But notice now what happens next. In verse 2 of chapter 17, it says, "And the word of the Lord came to him. Depart from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook Cherith that is east of the Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. As soon as Elijah delivers his message, the Lord then directs him to a place where there will be water and where he will be sustained throughout the period of this drought. The brook Cherith, or Kerith, was just where Elijah needed to be. You see, Elijah could not have known on his own where to go to be safe from Ahab and also have the food and water that he needed to survive. As the drought went on and the supplies of water and food began to dwindle, people would begin then to cluster around the few remaining sources. Those places, of course, would be the perfect location for Ahab to find Elijah. But God sent Elijah straight from Ahab's palace to the brook Cherith. But notice that it was only when Elijah delivered his message that he was given then instructions on where to wait out the drought. Friends, there's an important principle revealed by this story. You don't get to Cherith without going through Samaria. God will provide the next step for you when you have completed the last step. So friends, I have to ask you, has God asked you to do something that maybe feels hard to do, that feels dangerous? If God has, don't be afraid to be faithful to him, because he will not fail to provide for you. While God had to withhold rain from the whole country, he did not fail to provide for his servant Elijah. God always provides for his servants. Whatever God asks you to surrender, your time perhaps, or your plans, or your friends, or your money, or your reputation, or perhaps some unhealthy part of your life, whatever it is, God always makes it up. Never be afraid to do whatever God asks you to do, because God always takes care of his servants. When Jen and I were in Michigan at the seminary there, we faced a very difficult situation where we saw God provide for us, where we saw God be faithful to take care of us. At the time, Jen was pregnant with our second son, Jude, and we went into a routine visit to the obstetrician at 32 weeks, so about 8 weeks before her due date. And Jen had been having some occasional contractions, minor contractions, pretty common and normal as a woman's body gets prepared to deliver a baby. But when the doctor began to monitor her there in the office, the doctor saw that the contractions were actually much more frequent and much more regular than even Jen had realized. She was alarmed at this, very concerned at this early stage in the pregnancy. She sent us across the street to the emergency room right away. Jen was checked into to a room. She was given some medicine. She was kept there in the critical care unit of the maternity wing. And after a day or two, finally, they released her. Her contractions hadn't been progressing, and so they let her come home, but she was on strict bed rest. Now, notice that she's still 8 weeks away from the expected delivery date. And since we had found out that Jen was pregnant, we had been saving our money. Trying to plan for how much the delivery would cost, all of the expenses of the OB care along the way. And we thought that we had enough money that we should be able to cover the deductible and the co-pays for the delivery and everything. But now, after a 2-day stay in the hospital, we had absolutely blown our budget. The drugs that she was given there were expensive. Of course, anytime you stay in an ICU or a critical care unit, it's going to be expensive. And of course, now that she came home and she was on bed rest, she wasn't able to work. I was in classes full time, and our arrangement had been that I was in class most of the day, and when I would come home, she would go to work, and I would watch Liam. He was a toddler at the time, and so we would swap our schedule like that. And so how could we take care of Liam and also keep a part-time job and also pay for all these unexpected medical costs? We had no idea and very little resources. It was stressful. It was an uncertain and anxious time in our lives. But we also knew that God was in control, and we reviewed the evidence together that we had seen in the past and how God had led us to that place and that time. We knew that God wouldn't send us somewhere and ask us to make these sacrifices without also taking care of our legitimate needs. And so we laid out our case before Him. We came to Him in prayer and we asked Him to help us. And immediately we saw that God did begin to take care of us. Jen's boss at the seminary where she was working let me step in and take over her part-time position because our schedules had been such that after I got done with school, now I was able to just go and take over her job that she had been working. That was one blessing. Jen, of course, couldn't be on full bed rest at the same time and take care of Liam all day. You can probably imagine how active toddlers can be, and Liam was certainly no exception to that general rule. But Jen's mom agreed to come out and stay with us while Jen was on bed rest and to help out a bit. The only problem was that she wasn't going to be able to get there for a week. And so we were stuck with this week with no way for Jen to take care of things at home and also remain on bed rest. And so it was a great blessing to us that our church there in Michigan set up a schedule and people signed up for different meals. They brought us every single one of our meals for an entire week. It was such a blessing to us at a time when we really needed it. We had some friends who came over during the day and helped Jen to watch Liam during the day, helped to entertain him and so forth while I was in class and working. God was providing the things that we needed. He was helping us to survive. Of course, we were still concerned about the money. We were living on an absolutely shoestring budget. There was no wiggle room in our living expenses. We couldn't even put these medical costs on credit because we had no money left in our budget to pay on any debt. And of course, there wasn't really any time left in the day for either of us to try to earn more money, so that was kind of out of the question. Beyond this, then, Jen was in the hospital 2 or 3 more times with false labor before she did end up delivering. And so we knew that there would be even more costs added on when everything was done. But finally then, after Jude was born, after we got all of the bills for the OB care and the hospital visits and the delivery, at about the same time, we received an unexpectedly large tax return, significantly more than we had anticipated, just at the right time for us to pay all of the costs. Not once, friends, did we have to go without something that we needed. God provided everything that we needed. Yes, we were pretty poor, but we had what we needed. And so, friends, I can testify to you today that God provides for His servants. I can tell you that you can move forward to follow His will with confidence that He will be there for you when you're faithful to Him. And this story in 1 Kings gives us a contrast between these two characters that we've seen so far in this story, Ahab and Elijah. We're going to see more of that in the future as I share more of Elijah's story with you. But Ahab and Elijah function as archetypes. They represent 2 distinct pathways in life that we can learn from. Notice the differences between Ahab on the one hand and Elijah on the other. Ahab refuses to surrender to God, while Elijah surrenders to God in everything. Ahab is malleable, he is morally weak, while on the other hand, Elijah is firm, he is stalwart, he is morally strong. Ahab lives by the law of doing what is easiest, while Elijah lives by the law of doing what is right. When God steps in, when God intervenes, God is forced to withhold from Ahab for his own good, but God is able to provide for Elijah to bless him. So friends, this story gives us 2 pathways to consider as we continue on in our lives. Which path do you want to emulate in your life? Ahab's or Elijah's? We emulate one or the other of them with all kinds of little decisions that we make, all these little actions we take day by day. Are we going to be morally strong or morally weak? Are we going to be surrendered to God, or are we going to refuse to surrender to God? Are we going to stay strong and do what is right, or give in to temptation? Will we look to the world, or will we look to God's word to guide us? Friends, I wonder whether there's some way right now that God is leading you. Is His Spirit convicting you of something today? Are you listening to His Spirit as He guides you? Never be afraid to surrender to God in anything. And so, friends, I want to invite you to ask God to reveal His plans to you clearly as we sing our closing song this morning. I want to invite you to look to God, to look to Jesus, to put your hope and your trust in Him. Friends, I want to invite you this morning to make a decision to follow Him in everything that you do, knowing that He will be there for you because He is trustworthy. Reflect on that as we sing and open your heart to Him because He will provide for you if you follow Him.